Welcome to MURCIR Wednesday Talks, dear guest. I'm Zuhal Mert Uzuner. I'm the director of Marmara University Research Center for International Relations, shortly MURCIR. Wednesday Talks are one of the most important activities of our center. We are a 30 years old center, and our activities are mainly focusing on international relations, political science, and generally an interdisciplinary approach we have. That's why you can find many interesting speeches and also the speakers in our activities. So today's guest is a very prominent scholar from Koç University, Professor Şener Aktürk, and we are planning to discuss on his latest article. Maybe he has a newest one because he's very productive academician. That's why, if I am wrong, please correct me. The new article, the latest article, what I mean as Not So Innocent, Clerics, Monarchs, and Ethnoreligious Cleansing of Western Europe. This article was published in International Security, volume 48, and the article explains the factors of ethno-religious cleansing of non-Christians in medieval Western Europe, and it has very interesting arguments inside. I was planning to summarize the arguments inside the article, but then I decided to leave the floor to our dear guest. Professor Aktürk, welcome to our activity, our MURCIR talk, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Uzuner, for this introduction and for inviting me to this talk, for hosting this talk, giving me the opportunity to explain the arguments in Not So Innocent, Clerics, Monarchs, and the Ethno-Religious Cleansing of Western Europe. I'd like to start by laying out the outcome and the argument in a nutshell. Around the 11th century, by the 1000s, we could find sizable Jewish and Muslim communities and/or Muslim communities in England, France, Portugal, Spain, what is present-day Italy and Hungary. By the time we get to the 16th century at the latest, and in many other polities much earlier, there was not a single Jewish or Muslim or any other organized non-religious religious community in any of these countries in Western Europe. This is an unprecedented development because it made Western Europe, this set of countries that I just went over, the region of Western Europe as the religiously most homogeneous region in the world. So in a sense, this is not a relative argument. I'm not comparing levels of homogeneity or violence in Western Europe with other regions because it's binary. I mean, of course, you had episodes of violence, expulsions, forced conversions in other regions of the world, but all of these other regions still retained sizable religious and sectarian minorities that differed from the dominant religion and sect. It is important to emphasize this. So in this respect, Western Europe became unique in the sense that all the inhabitants of these territories, at least publicly, officially, became Christian, and beyond that, Catholic only, until the break of the Protestant Reformation, of course. So this question as such hasn't been tackled, addressed, answered to the best of my knowledge until my article, which itself is a puzzle, why the ethno-religious cleansing of Western Europe as a whole hasn't been addressed in the social sciences. Therefore, I leave this as a challenge to other social scientists. So because this is the outcome that I uncover and the puzzle I try to explain. And I would insist on my question and my puzzle, even if you disagree on my explanation, which I'm going to get to. So some readers, scholars might, again, this is the nature of scholarship. Some scholars might disagree on my explanation, exact explanation of why and how and when this happened. But then I would challenge them to provide a better explanation as to why this unprecedented development happened, because it begs for an explanation. This is not a insignificant development. And these 6 countries are not insignificant countries in world history, especially 4 of them, England, France, Portugal, and Spain, then went on to colonize and shape more than half of the rest of the world. All of the Americas, much of sub-Saharan Africa, Oceania, Australia, the Pacific Ocean. So England and France, Portugal and Spain basically stamped and shaped the rest of the world. So the fact that they themselves got rid of all the Jews and Muslims in the centuries before and became Christian only and Western Christian only polities by late medieval period actually has huge repercussions, implications for the rest of the world, for the modern world. These countries include the first democracies in the world, England and France. They include the largest colonial empires in the world, again, Portugal, Spain, England, and France. They include the earliest nation states, and so on and so forth. We can go on and on for hours on the global historical significance of England, France, Portugal, and Spain. And this story, this explanation, applies to all of them, plus what we know as present-day Italy and Hungary. So why is it that every single Jewish and Muslim community was eradicated, eliminated in these polities? This elimination happened through mass expulsions, often massacres, or forced conversions, or a combination of the 3. But the end result of all 3 methods is the elimination of the community. So my explanation of this phenomenon is based on the coincidence of 3 factors in medieval Western Europe that was unique. The first factor is the rise of the clerics. That is also in the title of my article, which, by the way, is open access. So feel free to download, print, share, teach, send the article as much as you like. That was a purpose of, having it published open access. And you can find all the maps, graphs, and figures that I might occasionally refer to in my talk in the map. The rise of the clerics, the rise of Roman Catholic clerics is a distinctive feature because the Roman Catholic clergy, starting with the Gregorian reforms of the late 11th century, 1075, 1059. 1059 would be the earliest. By 1073, 1075, it's definitely happening. What is known as the Gregorian reform or Gregorian revolution, identified with Pope Gregory VII, strengthened the clergy vis-a-vis the monarchs and secular authority. It made the clerical elections immune to secular interference. So the papal election was completely insulated or isolated from outside secular interference, and Pope claimed the right to appoint all the archbishops and bishops across Christendom. But there are many, many other dimensions of the papal clerical authority strengthening. I'll get to it if and when we have time. So this is the first important factor. The religious authority in Western Catholic Christianity was unusually strong, supranational, with its own territory, the papal states, with its own military and economic resources. It was the largest landowner across Christendom. It had its own taxes, and of course, it had its own supranational bureaucracy and cadres. The clergy in every Christian country was subordinate to the papacy. This does not have a functional equivalent in other religious sectarian traditions, not even in Eastern Christianity. So even Orthodoxy, Coptic Church, Assyrian, Syriac, Nestorian churches, they don't have the same supranational economic, political, bureaucratic power that the Roman Catholic Church under papacy acquired, let alone the non-Christian religions. There is no equivalent of the clergy in mainstream Islam or a supranational authority that can, punish and remove monarchs as the papacy can. But I'm going to get to that in my third factor. So one is the rise of the clergy starting in the late 11th century, and they are going to peak in the 13th century. Pope Innocent III, whose name is in the title of my article, actually, Not So Innocent, is a pun referring to Pope Innocent III because he's almost universally recognized as the most powerful pope of the Middle Ages and by extension of history because he shaped so much. So by the time we get to Innocent the Third and the 13th century, papacy and the clergy are at the peak of their power. And it's not coincidental that some of the largest waves of expulsion and eradication of Muslims and Jews happens, and other non-Christians happens in the 13th century. There's a correlation between the rise of papal clerical power and elimination, eradication of Jews, Muslims, and other non-Christians. So that's the first factor. The second factor is the motivation. What motivated the papacy and the clergy under papal leadership to get rid of Jews and Muslims? Because even if they are very powerful, it doesn't necessarily follow that they would want to destroy, annihilate, eradicate all non-Christians. Why? What is the motivation? Again, not every religious authority necessarily would want to get rid of religious minorities. And here, I think, again, the motivation, we can talk about two motivations combined and peaking in the 13th century. The first motivation is that Jews and Muslims lived under Catholic Christian rule for centuries, and yet they did not convert. And this shook the belief in Christianity's superiority. For the clerics, this was a challenge to clerical authority. They even feared that continued existence of Jews and Muslims and their contact with Christians would lead to Christians converting to Judaism or Islam. So they feared that they are going to lose their Christian populations over to Judaism or Islam. So they had a kind of religious insecurity in that sense. They feared the existence of public Judaism and public Islam in Western Europe. The second one is more factional, and I think that's perhaps an even more original contribution of my article, because I argue that Jews and Muslims were natural allies of the monarchs in their struggle against the papacy and the clerics. The big political struggle of the Middle Ages, as many medieval historians write, within Christian society is between papacy, clerics, and the emperor and the monarchs, right? The famous investiture conflict is about that. Right, Pope Gregory and then the emperors walk to Canossa to seek forgiveness from the Pope in their conflict over appointing bishops. So there is this continuous dynamic of intra-Christian struggle between the clerics and the aristocracy, monarchs, etc. In that struggle, Jews and Muslims were resources, assets, and allies of the monarchs. This was legally also the case because Muslims, also Jews, were serfs of the royal chamber, legally speaking. So they were property of the monarch. Monarch could make money out of them, could, economically and militarily benefit from them. Muslims could serve as the soldiers, for example, as they did in Italy of Christian monarchs and emperors. Again, Jews served important economic functions, and they also benefited the monarch, but they did not benefit the papacy. So papacy and the clerics, they didn't derive any benefits from the existence of Muslims or Jews, but monarchs did. So by destroying Jews and Muslims, papacy and the clerics were also destroying important assets and allies of the monarchs in that struggle. That's why in the article I emphasize that in a way, Jews and Muslims are collateral damage. The real big fight is between the papacy and the emperor, or clerics on the monarchs. And in between, Jews and Muslims get destroyed because they are identified as assets and resources of the monarchy. So that is the motivation why the clerics, the clergy, are motivated to eliminate non-Christians. But even these two factors, I don't think, are sufficient to explain such a massive ethno-religious cleansing across all of Western Europe, right? Because you can imagine that an emperor should be able to successfully resist papal clerical pressures from papacy and the bishops and so on and so forth. And that's why the third factor is also very important and kind of unique again until that point in history to Western Europe. And that's the geopolitical division of Western Europe into very small states. Since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, Western Europe never had a hegemonic empire or polity. We know that Napoleon tried, and others have tried and failed. Charles, the Habsburgs, Hitler, there were many attempts to establish a hegemonic empire in Western Europe. They've all failed. And Europe continued to have, especially in the medieval period, in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, very tiny states, city-states, duchies, Burgundy, Navarre, Castile, Aragon. These are Portugal. These are, comparatively speaking, very small states compared to what we have in Eurasia and elsewhere in the world. Why is this important? Because Western Europe was so divided in a fierce military competition for survival among very tiny states. Papacy could instigate one Western European kingdom or princely state against another. Right? So if the king of Sicily did not obey papal or clerical demands to convert Jews or expel Muslims, papacy could rally a French king or an English prince from the north to do that. It could organize a crusade, it could offer indulgence, and that's exactly what happened. This division of secular authority also made papacy particularly strong. This could not have happened in other parts of the world, also because other parts of the world had hegemonic empires: Byzantine Empire, Russian Empire, Ottoman Empire, Mughal Empire, the Ming Empire, and so on and so forth. So if a religious authority tried to overthrow, kill the monarch, the emperor in one of these regions, it would be the religious authority that would probably get killed, because they were so weak vis-a-vis the imperial secular authority. And in Islamic polities, late Ottoman Empire being an example, religious authority was even appropriated by the Sultan himself. So this competition would be completely impossible, because there is no other higher religious authority that could compel the Sultan or the emperor to do one thing or the other. All of these three factors come together to explain why and how the papacy, through the clergy, Ruhban, across Europe, was a unique religious kingmaker. Other religious authorities were not kingmakers. Papacy really overthrew many dynasties and replaced them with others that they preferred. They could punish, kill, exile, etc., princes, kings, even emperors. And they regularly did this. I mean, this is not something theoretical. In history, this happened many, many times. Whereas we can't really think of a scenario where the Patriarch of Moscow would get rid of Romanovs and replace them with a different dynasty, or some religious authority overthrowing the Ottoman dynasty and just replacing them with a different family. Examples can be multiplied. Religious authorities in other parts of the world were not kingmakers. Roman Catholic Church and the papacy was a kingmaker, and that's the major difference. And Of course, I can't go over the cases, but I again refer our viewers to have a look at the article where I go through the ethno-religious cleansing of Italy first. Sicily was majority Muslim for more than 2 centuries, and Muslims lived under Christian rule for almost 250 years. So it took a long time to eradicate all of the Muslims and also Jews in southern Italy, and all the in the eradication, the destruction, elimination of Jews and Muslims, the papal clerical authority intervened in many critical turning points to encourage or coerce, urge monarchs, secular authorities to do this. And then I go over the same process in southern France, where a religion or sect, we don't even know what exactly it is, called Cathars, used to be very popular in Toulouse, Béziers, Carcassonne, in all of what we know as southern France today. And there is no trace of this religion left because the papacy organized a 20-year-long crusade, the Albigensian Crusade, that is described as genocidal, war of extermination by, historians, that completely reshaped southern France, made it southern France because they mobilized the northern French to also contribute to this. And today we have nothing left of this religion or sect that is eradicated, Cathars. And France had multiple expulsions of Jews, 4 expulsions altogether, the biggest ones being in the 13th century again. 13th and early 14th century, that made it a Christian polity. The English story, England was actually the first kingdom to entirely expel its Jews in 1290, and there were no Jews in England for the next 3.5 centuries at least, and no other non-Christians. And the final, and Hungary has a similar story. Hungary had Muslims in the 13th century, but by the end of the 13th century, that would be 1300, there was not a single Muslim left, and the papacy intervened over and over again with the Hungarian king and his advisors not to employ any Muslims in the bureaucracy in the kingdom, and so on and so forth. And then the Hungarian Muslim population was eradicated. And the final chapter in the story is the best known one, and that's Spain and Portugal. The Andalusia, which had the largest Jewish population in medieval world before the expulsions, and it was majority Muslim for many centuries. Some put the number as high as 5 million, which is, even if it's exaggerated, even if it's a couple of millions, that's still a majority and a very sizable population. Even Portugal had 37 Muslim communities just before the expulsion, let alone in the earlier centuries, because Portugal was the first Iberian kingdom to expel all Muslims, and then Castile, Navarre, and Aragon followed. So with the expulsion of the final Muslim communities of Western Europe in Aragon, which is now eastern Spain, there was not a single active mosque or Muslim community left anywhere in Western Europe. And similarly, with the final expulsions of Jews from Spain, you basically didn't have any Jews left. So this made Europe unique. And in doing this, and I'm trying to then bring it to the present and talk about some of its implications theoretically and empirically for our present day. In doing this, the papacy used many instruments of power that it basically invented and attributed to itself during the Gregorian reform. For example, excommunication, apharos, in the way that we know, was actually developed in the 13th century. The previous form of excommunication didn't have the same quality. Interdict, which is basically depriving an entire country or kingdom from religious services. This was used by the papacy a lot, and it was developed in the 13th century. For example, the papacy put England in interdict, which means you can't have, Sunday mass. You can't bury anyone with religious rites. You can't, baptize a child. All of these religious services, an entire country is deprived of them in order to punish its monarch, right? In order to punish the English king, the papacy would say England is placed under interdict. Clerics are not going to perform any religious services anywhere. And again, imagine that in medieval period, people care a lot about these religious services. They genuinely. So it's a big punishment, and interdict was used a lot. And again, crusade, for example, that we think is a nowadays a key kind of feature of Christianity and Western Christianity, but it's a new innovation. The first crusade is in 1096, almost the end of 11th century. You didn't have a crusade in the first 1,000 years of Christian history. So Pope Urban II in the Clermont Council all of a sudden said, Deus vult, the God wills it. God wills what? God wills this holy war. So he came up with this. He invented a crusade, which of course then extremely augmented, aggrandized papal power, because he was putting together a supranational military power for papal purposes. And the Crusaders killed Jews along the way. The First Crusade also, not surprisingly, coincided with the first large massacres of Jews on Rhineland on their way to the Middle East. And of course, once they reached the Middle East, they massacred Muslims in the capture and occupation of Jerusalem. Muslims and Jews were killed by the Crusaders, and this became a pattern over the second, the third, and all the following crusades. And those are the Holy Land Crusades. What is less known, and what I emphasize in the article, is that papacy organized many internal crusades, Italian crusades. Papacy organized many crusades to southern Italy against Christian kings who didn't obey the papacy. Papacy organized crusades against southern France to punish, Count of Toulouse and other Christian princes and kings who didn't obey papal orders with regards to eradicating heresy. So papacy basically punished any monarch, any secular authority that didn't obey its commands. And it could do it through crusades. It had its own military orders, Templars, Hospitallers. It had religious orders, Dominicans and Franciscans, both of them established again in the 13th century. Again, you can see that many of these, the Dominicans, Franciscans, Templars, Crusaders, all of these things, excommunication, interdict, all of these powers were developed after the Gregorian reform, 1100s, 1200s, especially 1300s. They didn't exist in Christianity in its first 1,000 years. Papacy, with the Gregorian reform, which we could probably call a Gregorian revolution, because it reshaped Western Europe in so many fundamental ways, acquired these powers against secular authority. I've already briefly mentioned why we don't see this pattern in non-Catholic, non-Western regions, because they didn't have such a powerful supranational religious authority. Religious authorities in other parts of the world are usually limited in their authority to the state or polity where they are situated. So the Caliph of Cordoba only has power over, Andalusia. The Patriarch of Alexandria might have power over, Egypt, and that's it. Or the Patriarch of Moscow doesn't really have power beyond the Russian Empire. Whereas papacy is unique in that sense of having truly supranational military, economic, bureaucratic power in appointments, in mobilizing militaries, and in collecting taxes. From here, I'd like to move on to the implications of this finding for scholarship on, civilian victimization, ethnic cleansing and genocide, nation building, democracy, and other issues. First of all, the most direct contribution, theoretically, I think, of this study is about the origins of demographic engineering, one version of which is genocide and civilian victimization. Most of the scholars who study demographic engineering, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and civilian victimization more generally say that this phenomenon, or this bundle of phenomena, are associated with modern state building and nationalism. that this is a very new, modern 20th century, maybe 19th century phenomenon. Whereas I'm saying no, it already happened in the 13th century, at least 5-6 centuries before what many other scholars are saying. So this is a major revision, of course, to take demographic engineering and genocide from the 19th and 20th century all the way back to the 13th century, if not earlier. Another kind of part of the conventional wisdom on genocide and demographic engineering is that this is conducted by nation states, or even if it's not nation state, monarchs, secular authorities for secular monarchical national reasons within a given territory. But my case is not a single national or monarchical territory. It's an entire subcontinent. It's all of Western Europe. It's supranational. And the actors conducting it, papal clerical class, is supranational. So I am trying to explain genocide, ethnic cleansing, demographic engineering, not as a local or national phenomenon, but as a supranational kind of systemic phenomenon across the continent, half continent, let's say Western Europe. And relatedly to these first two contributions, much of the scholarship, because of its focus on modernity and modern nationalism and the state, thinks of the motivations for genocide, ethnic cleansing, and demographic engineering to be secular, national, modernist, whereas I'm clearly saying no, they could be medieval and religious, and that's what the clerics were doing. For example, there are many, many names one could mention, but James Scott, for example, has recently passed earlier last year, has a famous book, Seeing Like a State. Right, how some high modernist projects create the tragedies in the modern world, Soviet Union, Tanzania, and many other examples that he discusses. And he also, just like the mainstream scholarship on this, thinks that demographic engineering and this kind of high modernism, social engineering, is a factor of recent modern life. What I'm trying to say with this article is that social engineering, demographic engineering, these projects could be attributed to the Catholic clergy in the 13th century, that this is the origins, this period and this class, clerics, are the origins of demographic and social engineering. All the later generations or iterations of this phenomenon in some respects share similarities with the clerics. The clerics' vision of a perfect Christian Catholic society with the clergy as the first order, close to heaven, sinless and angelic, as they describe themselves, right, in the sky. The oratores, the ones who pray, as the peak of the pyramid and close to God and angelic. And underneath them, the bellatores, the fighters, basically the aristocrats and the kings. And below them, the third class, the lowest, laborotes, the agriculturales, the workers, anyone who doesn't belong to the clergy or the aristocracy would be the third class, right? So this was a kind of Christian Catholic utopia for which they sacrificed and got rid of all Jews and Muslims. And in later periods, and that's why towards the end of the article, in the beginning and also at the end, I refer to examples that people usually think are very far from the Catholic clergy. One example is Soviet Union and the communist nomenclatura. This is basically an example of a militant atheist clergy, because they also have an ideology, Soviet communism, which is identified with another savior class. The equivalent of Catholic clergy would be Soviet nomenclatura, party leadership, that is going to shape every society around the world through class struggle and class warfare, and if necessary, massacres, into some sort of perfect utopian society. And it's supranational as well. And we do see, for example, a most gruesome example of this would be Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, right? In many countries that went through communist revolutions, you have the equivalent of a basically communist clergy, if I may say, leading a supranational international war, a class war against their co-nationals, fellow countrymen and women who are not from the correct class, leading to mass violence in China, in Cambodia, in Soviet Union itself, of course, in Afghanistan, any country or polity where communist revolution was attempted. And another example I give in the article is Iran. I mean, although mainstream, what we would say Sunni Islam doesn't have the equivalent of a clergy and, papacy, etc., some strands of Shiite Islam centered on Iran do. And Iran's influence in the Middle East, Syria was a prime example of this, of demographic, religious, social engineering, bringing in Shiites from other parts of the world, settling them in places where Sunnis were forcibly removed. This was also resembling, again, the modus operandi of the Catholic clergy in the medieval era or the Soviet nomenclatura during the Cold War. So this explanation isn't just limited to medieval Europe, not at all. Any place where we can find, and it doesn't have to be religious, that's why I mentioned the communist nomenclatura, any equivalent of a supranational, international clergy who think they are the possessors of the truth, and who have the right to, lead society by purifying it from undesirable populations, classes, ethno-religious professional groups. We could see the same pattern repeating itself, and unfortunately we do. Finally, I'm not saying I explain every case of ethnic cleansing or genocide. That's absolutely not my claim. There could be multiple different paths to ethnic cleansing and genocide. That's very much established in the literature. I'm not saying I explain Rwanda, right? I mean, that could be purely local and ethno-nationalist, and almost certainly is. Many other modern cases are. That's why my intervention here is to broaden this discussion from its excessive focus on the 20th, 21st century to try to find the origins of this phenomenon. When did it first start? When did we first have cadres, elites, groups who try to purify entire societies through violence and re-education, expulsion, forced conversion? I think the first example is the Catholic clergy of the medieval Western Europe. Later in history, we have this phenomenon in many different parts of the world, in secular and religious reiterations or versions of this phenomenon. But it's important to have a genealogy of this phenomenon so that we can identify how it was transformed over the centuries in different parts of the world. Thank you very much for your interest and patience. I'd be happy to answer any questions or comments you might have.
Okay, now it's open, I suppose. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay. Thanks for your very interesting presentation. Actually, the article was also very interesting to read. And actually, in MURCIR and also in my personal readings, we have so many different perspectives in the last years. Maybe you follow, we host Ayşe Zarakol in our, let's say, the Wednesday talks. And she was also bringing something, let's say, interesting to our frame of discussion by referring again very old, very, let's say, a little bit, let's say, older matters into, again, our agenda of international relations as historian. Why I refer that? Because when I look at your article, I see something very attractive for me to understand today and to understand what's happening. Maybe, as you mentioned very rightly, to expand this frame a little bit more to understand the reason. You are right. Many of us, and me as a part of this circle, we are explaining all these happenings, the bloodshed and the ethnic conflicts, by referring modernity, because as we know, modernity you brought a standard perspective, a one truth, which is defined by somehow, let's say, scientific or with one type, one form of truth existence. So now you are talking about this, let's say, the breaking out this argument that all the evil comes from nationalism and the standardization of, let's say, coming together with nationalism. Yes, and what is also another interesting part in your article, according to me, it's not moving us to a, let's say, a little bit older, again, the discussion depending on civilizational perspective or, let's say, the culturalist perspective. That's why I had a kind of comparison in my mind with the discussions of Aisha Zarakol. Because when I'm listening to you, I understood again that we need to understand the transformations in history to understand what may wait for us, because, you know, we are observing all these happenings around us, especially with the rise of new government in United States. We started to hear again so many civilizational concepts, but they are maybe a little bit different than the pure, let's say, the culturalist perspective. So my question is, do you think that is it possible to have a rise of a new Rome? I mean, new, let's say, the papal, let's say, the center, power center in a different form. Not only Zarakol and you, and also another really important name for me in my readings. I'm looking at this, the ex finance minister of Greece. Oh, I forget now the name. Techno-feudalism.
Is it Varoufakis? Yannis
Yes,
Varoufakis?
sorry. Yes, I couldn't remember in one moment. So, techno-feudalism is also talking about rise of a new group, maybe a new ownership, so that the economic structure is changing, so these groupings are changing, new, let's say, the rulers are emerging. So my question is it possible to explain the rise of populism and xenophobia in Europe from this approach? Do you see some signs of your argument in contemporary developments? I hope it's not so complicated.
It's a very broad question, so I can
Yes,
only
yes, maybe we
pick,
may make it a little bit narrow, but
pick and
I hope
choose
I
different.
can explain my point.
Yes, I can pick and choose different aspects of it. So, and there's so much one could say. One, I think, common thread, and you mentioned Ayşe Zarakol, and before the West, for example. I think we could also think about after defeat, her first book is to kind of, in a way, yes, provincialize Europe. And look at the West from a non-Western point of view and situate its rise and fall potentially from what were the alternative world systems before, and what is the distinctive feature of the Western system. As for the civilizations debates, which were extremely popular, of course, after all, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations is probably one of the most cited political science articles of the last 30, 40 years. But for example, what Huntington identified as an advantage, a superior feature of the West, was the separation of religion and state. He has that section in his article where he talks about, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's and give unto God what is God's. This distinction between the two swords, the so-called Gelasian doctrine, which I also refer to in my article, the separation between the two swords, the secular and the religious. But in my article, I'm basically saying there was a huge downside, a dark side to that separation. It is because of that separation that the religious authority could be monopolized by a certain class of people, the clergy, and it could be wielded against the rest of society. If you didn't have such a strict separation, you wouldn't have the story that I'm actually telling. So in a way, not all good things go together. So that's one part of it. Against the Western triumphalist kind of discourse about the rise of the West, I'm saying, well, the rise of the West also had this really dark backstory. Destruction of all Jews and Muslims, so that it rose with a single religion and sect, and it has repercussions for the present day. And I am actually coming to your other questions step by step, because England, for example, is a paradigmatic case, right, for social sciences, whether we study nation state or democracy or capitalism or industrialization, because England is the first society for all of these. Now, when we also recognize, as I urge our readers and viewers to recognize, that England, with the expulsion of Jews, became a Catholic and Western Christian society only, that it built the model parliament and the parliaments after that for many, many centuries, based on such religious sectarian homogeneity, it actually gives us a flavor of Western modernity, that it was based on assumed religious sectarian homogeneity, sameness. So it is unsurprising that Western Europeans and their descendants, having lived in a Christian heritage only region for almost 800 years, are now struggling and scrambling with diversity of lifestyles and religions and sects, which Indians or Lebanese, Middle Easterners, East Asians, South Asians, Eastern Europeans wouldn't necessarily, because that was a fact of life historically for them for 1,000+ years, right? So there is that difference between, I think, Western modernity and the non-Western regions. In Western modernity, having this homogeneous template. That's why even when Jews and Muslims, through emancipation and citizenship, are admitted to Western society, they are admitted as individuals, and they are expected to assimilate and kind of conform to a very homogeneous template. You wouldn't have, I think, as big discussions around ritual animal slaughter, which is quite kind of key for Jewish or Muslim kosher and halal meat production, or the circumcision of male children, which are issues discussed in Northern Europe and Western Europe, although they are such minor issues if you think about the entire spectrum of lifestyles and issues that could be politicized or publicly debated. So, and the populist reaction, in part, I'm not going to overstep and say I can explain the rise of populism. That's, a very multidimensional phenomenon. But one part of it surely is a reaction to a diversity that Western societies did not experience for half a millennium. Why? Because the papacy and the clergy got rid of Jews and Muslims and any other sizable non-Christian population in the 1300s, at the latest by 1500s. So they are, reacting to this kind of diversity. Now, clergy, of course, so in that sense, it's a reaction to diversity. But populism everywhere is also a reaction to elite privilege. And in that sense, it could be anti-clerical, because the clergy were an elite. And when I wrote a short follow-up to this article for Broad Street, it's titled West's Troubled Origins. I tried to link this finding to origins of democracy, which I already briefly mentioned. Both Britain and France and other Western states started establishing their first modern parliaments, and from there, eventually parliamentary democracy, only after they got rid of Jews and Muslims. In the case of Spain, Leon has the oldest parliament in Europe. If I'm not mistaken, it's 1150, something like this, 1188. I think it's recognized as the oldest parliament. And this is one of the Crusader kingdoms of Spain in the north. So in a way, elimination of religious minorities went hand in hand with establishing parliaments and building democracy. But the kind of Jacobin secularism that we associate with France, and to a certain extent from France, maybe Italy and Turkish Republic borrowed this originally in the 20s, and many other countries around the world. But it is a direct response to the papal clerical power that I explain in the article. The papacy and the clergy were the first demographic engineers. They recorded individuals from birth, baptism, to death, their burial, their marriage, annual confessions in the church of their intimate sins and, personal lives, annual communions and Sunday masses. So they exerted a very high level of control and power over society and individuals. So the kind of radical anti-religious, anti-clerical French type of secularism, in a way, is a direct consequence of the papal clerical quasi-totalitarian power that the papacy and the clergy attained. That's why it's impossible to understand, I think, radical secularism without first understanding the papal clerical background. Again, that's one other dimension. I think that might be enough for now. But in every generation, we still have today, people working with algorithms to order society, to put them into boxes, and to create some kind of perfect society by using AI, artificial intelligence and whatnot. The dystopian, science fiction movies and novels and stories reflect a certain kind of tendency in modern or late modern life and world. And I think, again, that tendency, that aspiration, that nightmare could be traced back to the popes and the clerics. And the kind of vision they had, which they tried to impose and actually succeeded to a considerable extent in imposing on Western Europe, and that did, provoke eventually negative reaction from society, eventually from the kings and emperors. I mean, that's eventually how we have Protestantism. Finally, when some princes and kings can break with Rome and they protest Catholic power and they establish their own church and religion, and the King of England breaks and establishes the Church of England, and we have Anglicanism. But by that time, Western Europe is already significantly shaped in the previous 300, 400 years. So in many ways, Lutheranism and the other religious and non-religious traditions that follow, to a certain extent, unconsciously carry the homogeneous tradition, heritage, framework, mold that the Catholic clergy established. So I can't, for example, say Lutheranism became more tolerant or more multiculturalist or than Catholicism. I don't think it did. When I read Martin Luther and see the practice of German and North German and Scandinavian, etc., Lutheran polities, I don't see that. In many ways, they reproduced Catholic persecution, except against non-Protestants this time. So, quis regio eius religio, whose religion, his rule, in many ways is basically a duplication of the previous system, just in this case, including Protestants as the other option. You can either be Protestant if your king is Protestant, or you can be Catholic if your king and prince is Protestant. That's the only choice. Otherwise, within the territory itself, you will still be only Protestant Lutheran or only Catholic. So again, I can go on and on. But the main, I think, point here for your last question is that this is a very homogeneous template, right? It's like when we cook the cake or cookie, right? We have the cookie cutter. The cookie cutter is based on single religion and sect. And when you apply that cookie cutter to Eastern Europe, let alone, South Asia, India, Middle East, East Asia, with dozens of sects, mazhab, and religions, you are not going to have the same result. Because clearly there's a world of difference between Hinduism, Islam, and Jain and Christian, and all of them have to live under the Indian, for example, political umbrella. It requires different designs and different solutions and a different approach. Maybe luckily for the Western world, they have the non-Western experience to study and borrow from. So this borrowing and learning has to happen in both directions, non-West from the West and West from the non-West, to see what worked and what failed in the last 500 years or so. Long answer to a very multidimensional question.
But the question was not so tidy, sorry. It was not so, I mean, not so good composed, let's say. It was a tidy question. Let's hope not to have the realization of this reconquista. There are such kind of discourses now in politics of Europe. And there are so many things to learn from each other, as you mentioned. I would like to ask to Berat Urkut, maybe he would like to ask the question. Would you
Thank
like
you.
to have the floor? Yeah.
No, it was pleasant to listen Şener Hoca again and again, because I know this is not the first time he's presenting this paper, but I don't have a question for now, maybe in the next ones. But thank you, Şener Hoca, for this pleasant talk.
Thank you. You are welcome. Thank you for attending.
Thank you very much for all your, let's say, the efforts to explain your nice article. It is very impressive, and it provokes so many thoughts in our minds. And I hope to discuss in our next meetings, maybe in round tables with other prominent scholars, to discuss what's next in IR from your research perspective, because really it provokes so many things in our mind. But as you know, these online events have a time limit and we have to finish right now. Would you like to say a few more words to finalize your talk?
I thank you and our viewers a lot for their interest. I will insist on what I briefly mentioned at the beginning of our session. I insist on my question rather than my answer and explanation. It is understandable that people may disagree on why exactly and through whom and when and how this process has happened. But more important for me was to broach this question and puzzle. Why is it that in Western Europe and Western Europe alone, we did not have a single non-Christian organized community, not a single active mosque, not a single active synagogue left from the medieval era, continuously operating to the present day? Why and how is it that Western Europe developed in this uniquely homogeneous fashion with regards to the religious sectarian belief of its population? This is the big question and puzzle. I've struggled for over a decade and worked on this article for many, many years. I hope other scholars and students also find it interesting and perhaps come up with better explanations or different angles and different examples where this process happened or didn't happen in different parts of the world. This is my sincere hope for us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we hope to see all our listeners in another event. Please do not forget to follow us, because it promotes us for having access to other, let's say, the interested group of people. Thank you and hope to see you again. Thanks, Professor Aktürk. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor Uzuner.